Wellington goes to New Zealand. Wellington was an emperor penguin, the tallest and heaviest of all penguins. He had a big white belly with a splash of yellow on his chest and around his ears. He lived in a colony with his mum and dad in Antarctica, way down in the furthest reaches of the South Pole. It's very, very, very cold in Antarctica. There is lots of snow on the ground and plenty of fish in the sea. It has everything that an emperor penguin could ever want. But despite this, Wellington was not a happy penguin. Ever since he was a little baby, he had dreamed of going to a place called New Zealand. He wasn't sure exactly where New Zealand was, but he guessed it must be pretty close to Old Zealand. He wanted to go there for two main reasons. The first was that he liked the name. He wasn't very fussed about the new part, but he really liked the word Zealand. Z was his favourite letter. He liked its jagged shape and the sound that it made. He liked to try and think of other words beginning with Z. This was a difficult task because there aren't many, and there certainly aren't many other countries with the letter Z in their name. This made New Zealand special in his mind. The second reason he wanted to go to New Zealand was because this was the place that his grandma, the famous explorer known as Sandra of the Antarctic, travelled to 44 years ago. She was the first emperor penguin ever to make it to New Zealand. Wellington, who was named after the city in New Zealand where his grandma visited, loved to listen to tales of her adventures. He didn't see her very often, as she was always off in some distant land exploring, but she would send postcards every month. Every day while his friends were out playing hide-and-seek and sliding down the icy mountains into the freezing sea, Wellington would be ambling along with his head in the clouds, daydreaming about New Zealand. "Oh, what's wrong with you today?" said Wellington's best friend Clyde one day. Wellington replied in a sad voice, "I don't want to live in Antarctica, it's boring. I want to go to New Zealand and be an explorer like my grandma." "Don't be silly, Wellington," said Clyde. "Everybody knows that emperor penguins don't live in New Zealand. It's not cold enough. Your grandma had to be rescued when she went there." "I don't care," said Wellington. "I still want to go." "But what about all your friends and your mum and dad? Won't you miss us all?" "When I'm in New Zealand, I'll be too busy exploring and having adventures to think about friends and family. Besides, I'll be the most famous penguin in the world, and I will make lots of new friends." "Oh," said Clyde, shrugging his shoulders. He was disappointed to hear Wellington talk that way, because they had been best friends for many years, and he didn't like to think that Wellington thought so little of him. But as the weeks and months passed by, he forgot all about the conversation and went about his daily routine of playing in the snow and fishing for shrimp. Meanwhile, Wellington kept daydreaming about leaving Antarctica. Then one day, Wellington bumped into Santa Claus. Santa liked to come to the South Pole on holiday after finishing work on Christmas Day. It was hard work delivering all the presents, and he liked to head down south to relax, away from the elves and the hustle and bustle of the grotto. Wellington always looked forward to Santa's visits because he loved to hear about all the places he had been to. He reminded him of his grandma, only he had a bigger beard. They talked for a few hours before Santa left to go and feed his reindeer. As he was leaving, Wellington noticed that something fell out of his pocket onto the snow. He was about to shout out to Santa, but he decided to take a closer look first. He squelched his way towards the mysterious object, and his eyes lit up as he realised that it was a map of the world. "This is exactly what I need," thought Wellington. "Penguins do not have pockets," so he put the map in his beak and walked away. As soon as Santa was out of sight, he stopped and looked at the map. He was amazed at all the different countries in the world. He could see the Antarctic right at the bottom. Above it were all sorts of strange shapes and names. His eyes kept wandering until at last, on the right-hand side of the page, he saw the place he was looking for, New Zealand. It was a small, thin little country compared to a lot of the others. This made him like it even more. He looked at the map carefully. It didn't seem like New Zealand was that far away. "I could swim there in no time," he thought, and he decided that he would leave the next morning. So as the sun rose, he left the colony, telling his mum and dad that he was going hunting. He was very excited to finally be leaving Antarctica, and so, as soon as he reached the water's edge, he dived in without a moment's hesitation. For the first few hundred miles he swam as quickly as he could. He soon became tired, though. After many hours he felt as though he couldn't go on any further. He began to panic as there was no land in sight and he could barely move his flippers. He felt himself sinking deeper and deeper into the water until he was completely submerged. Then, to his great surprise and relief, he was yanked into the air along with hundreds of little fish. He dangled in the air for several seconds with his face pressed against the green net before he dropped down onto the hard wooden deck of a fishing boat. He was quickly spotted by one of the fishermen, who undid the net and let him out. "What's a big emperor penguin like you doing so far out at sea?" asked the fisherman. "I'm going to New Zealand to be a famous explorer," replied Wellington. "Well, you've got a very long way to go. New Zealand is almost 2,000 miles from here. We are heading that way, though, so you can travel with us for a while if you like." "Thank you," said Wellington. He was very grateful for the fisherman's help. When the time came, Wellington thanked the fisherman once again and jumped off the boat into the sea. It wasn't long before he could see some cliffs in the distance. He rushed towards them with great excitement. As soon as he reached the shore, he fell to the floor, relieved to have finally made it to New Zealand. He lay there for all of 2 seconds before he jumped back up onto his feet. He was surprised by the gritty, orangey, yellowy dots he was now covered in. Wellington had never seen sand before. He didn't really like it. "Where's the snow?" he wondered. "I thought the whole world was covered in snow. This yellow stuff is rough and tickly. It sticks to my feathers and tastes disgusting." He dusted himself down and walked further inland. Even though it was summer in New Zealand, the beach seemed completely empty. He waddled along for hours until he stumbled across a mother and daughter building a sand castle. They were most surprised to see a big emperor penguin approaching them. "What are you doing here, funny penguin?" asked the child. "I've come from Antarctica on a great adventure," replied Wellington. He was very pleased to see such friendly people, so he stayed and watched them build their sand castle. He didn't help because his flippers were not much use for building sand castles, as he couldn't hold a bucket or spade. The mother asked Wellington if they could take a photograph of him with her phone. Wellington had never had his photograph taken before, but after being assured that it wouldn't hurt him, he happily posed for some pictures. She didn't think that anyone would believe her when she told them that she had seen an emperor penguin on the beach, so with Wellington's permission she sent one of the photographs to a few of her friends. The photograph was passed from person to person and word quickly spread of Wellington's incredible journey, until eventually it was featured on websites, magazines and newspapers all over the world. He soon became the most famous penguin in the world, just as he had predicted to Clyde. He was even more famous than the penguins who modelled for the chocolate bar rappers, or the ones who acted in films or on television programmes. Unfortunately, there is no newspaper or internet access in Antarctica, so Wellington's family and friends didn't get to hear about his remarkable trip. They all thought he was lost. So after he left Antarctica, a search party was sent out to look for him. For days they searched the glaciers, ice shelves and icebergs, but there was no sign of him. Eventually the search party gave up. So his mum, dad and Clyde kept looking because they loved him very much, and it upset them to think that he could be lost forever. Now that he was famous, Wellington found that he had very little time to himself. All sorts of funny people wanted to talk to him and listen to his story. This made him sad, because even though he was now an explorer, he still liked to play and have fun. And even though he was always surrounded by lots of people, he felt very lonely. One day he was being interviewed by a lady from the television, when all of a sudden he began to cry. "What's wrong?" said the lady. "I miss my mum and dad and my friends. I'm sick of being a famous explorer. I want to go home, but I can't because it's too far away. I almost drowned on my way here." Just as he was managing to control himself, he remembered what he had said to Clyde about not needing friends and family, and the tears came flooding back. A kind environmental scientist was watching the interview on his computer. He felt really sorry for Wellington. He knew what it was like to feel sad and lonely because he spent a long time away from his family on scientific expeditions. He decided to call the television studio and ask for Wellington's address. Wellington was staying at the local zoo, so he drove down to meet him. "My name's Jim, and I was watching your interview on the internet. I'm travelling to Antarctica tomorrow to study the melting ice caps, and I would like to offer you a lift back home." "Really?" said Wellington, his voice shaking with excitement. "That's very kind of you." The journey back seemed to take forever, but it gave Wellington a lot of time to think about how ungrateful he had been. Being away from home for such a long time made him appreciate how lucky he was to have such a loving family and caring friends. Although he was looking forward to going back home, he was also a little bit scared, as he thought his mum and dad would shout at him for running away without telling anyone. He was also nervous for what Clyde would say, after he had been so mean to him before he left. Wellington needn't have worried though, because when eventually the boat reached Antarctica and he made his way back to the colony, everyone was so happy to see him that no one mentioned how silly he had been. His mum and dad cried with happiness, and Clyde rushed over and gave him a big hug. The end.